I'm glad when we have a kind of signature event like this in which we're putting trade on the agenda as a development issue, not as a trade issue per se.
The general aim of the working group in the context of the Millennium Development Goals was to better integrate especially the least developed countries into the global economy. And so just to be clear up front in terms of terminology, we are focused on the UN designated least developed countries, which is now 49. And really to deliver on this part of this 8th Millennium Development Goal that Nancy mentioned, which is to form a global partnership for development. So it's what the more advanced countries can do to help the poor countries meet the other Millennium Development Goals of reducing severe poverty, hunger, and disease. And so that was our general aim. The particular focus of the group was to deliver meaningful duty-free, quota-free market access for the LDCs. So the first core recommendation is to include all products. The second one was that it's a little bit into some technical areas, but it's very important, which is that administrative details, and it's particularly rules of origin that determine the eligibility of products, should not be written such that in practice they block exports from these least developed countries. And that was one of the things the European Union's Everything But Arms program has. Everything but arms. So it's essentially 100% market coverage, as we recommend in the first principle. But the rules of origin are so restrictive that in practice, a lot of LDC exports are not able to get into the EU market. So that's our second recommendation, either avoid or change rules that have that effect. And the third core recommendation is that programs should be permanent or long-lasting so that they don't scare away investors with uncertainty. They should be predictable. But in the group, we don't stop there. That's sort of the core of the recommendations, but we go further and identify two other opportunities that we saw where the benefits of this initiative could be very much multiplied. The first comes from recognizing that South-South trade is of growing importance, and that's where the most rapidly growing markets are. And in fact, several emerging markets have either implemented or announced that they will implement preference programs for LDCs. China and India did so a few years, China, India, and Turkey actually. Turkey may have been the first, as part of its customs union with the EU, announced programs providing partial duty-free treatment for exports from LDCs. Brazil announced at the Geneva WTO ministerial in December that it would implement a program this year for LDCs, beginning with 80% product coverage and moving to 100% over 4 years, which, depending on the details and the rules of origin and so forth, could be what we would regard as a model program for the other advanced developing countries. So what we call on there is for those advanced countries with programs or others that might introduce them to also achieve these same three core recommendations, but over a longer period of time. The second supplementary but important recommendation was, again, came from recognizing that market access alone is not enough, especially for the least developed countries, and that the additional obstacles to their exports come from both non-tariff barriers in the importing countries, things like very burdensome sanitary and phytosanitary standards for food safety, or other kinds of technical or regulatory barriers where the point would not be to eliminate or to weaken those standards for least developed countries, but to provide some assistance to them in meeting those standards. But also there are many, many obstacles on the supply side in developing countries, ranging from inadequate infrastructure to poor policies of their own that need to be changed. And so it's obviously not the silver bullet on aid for trade that we might all like to see, but we think at least a starting point would be for preference giving and preference receiving countries to create mechanisms for cooperation and dialogue linked to the preference programs where they can identify, okay, we have the access, but the exports aren't happening. What else needs to happen, whether it's changes in policies, aid for trade, or something else? Probably the final question I'm sure a lot of you are asking is this really politically feasible? And the group concluded that yes, it was for two key reasons. One is simply that we're talking about the least developed countries, at least in this initial phase. We talked about whether or not it might make sense to expand the programs to a slightly larger group of small and poor countries, but concluded that achieving this Millennium Development Goal for the least developed countries was something we're striving for and would be difficult enough in itself. And so if you look at just those least developed countries, they account for less than 1% of global exports. So this is not something that would be costly for the rich countries to do. Secondly, I think there's already a great deal, as I mentioned before, a great deal of momentum behind this initiative. Last August, the European Union called for duty-free, quota-free market access to be put on the agenda for the G20 summit in Pittsburgh. Congressman Jim McDermott here in the United States introduced legislation in November that would go a long way towards expanding U.S. preferences for the LDCs. China last fall, which had had a relatively limited program covering only 400 line items, expanded its program to 95% of products. In December, as I mentioned, Brazil announced that it would be implementing a program that would move to 100% coverage by over 4 years. South Korea also, just this past January, expanded its product coverage for LDCs from 75% of products to 85% and has announced that they will expand that further to 95% by 2012. So a lot of countries do seem to have recognized that this is an important initiative for the LDCs and that it is something that is an important part of the Millennium Development Goals. As I mentioned, those are aimed at creating this global partnership, and there has been a lot of progress, but there's a lot more to be done. And what we're hoping in the group is that this is one Millennium Development Goal that can be fully achieved and well before 2015.
Now, we have a very good preference program, or one of the better preferences programs with Africa. So that's not so much the problem. The problem with Africa is we haven't given them the opportunity to improve their competitiveness. Most of the imports that come in from Africa either deal with oil or minerals. But what Africa needs is infrastructure. What Africa needs is capacity building. But for other countries, Bangladesh, Cambodia, we have some of the most outrageous tariff schemes in the world. And we've got to fix that. And if we do fix that, the president's objective of doubling American exports will be a walk in the park. If we can get the poor countries, where all the people live, to truly start benefiting from the benefits of the global economy, demand for American products, particularly American products that build infrastructure, you know, Caterpillar, a little commercial there, will grow dramatically. You take a country like Bangladesh, where the per capita is $464 per capita. We provide $90 million in aid, we being the United States, and we collect $522 million, over $500 million in tariff revenue from products made in Bangladesh. I mean, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or whether you believe in growth or equity. That's just outrageous, and we got to put an end to that.
Why is it so hard to do? I think there's a lot of political inertia and also a lot of received wisdom that is not very effectively challenged. As Kim and the paper lay out, the actual economic costs of doing duty-free, quota-free are rather small. There are some very specific and very narrow interests that would be impacted, but on the whole, the impacts are very small and easily managed, I think, at least in the U.S. for doing duty-free, quota-free. But there's very little counterpoint, which Bill makes, and a lot of sort of legacy ideas about the role of trade, and in particular the trade and the imports we receive from LDCs. And so rather than dig into it and really analyze it, it's much easier for congressional staff or even other policymakers to not challenge it and not work hard. I do think there is some momentum to make change, and we do see a core congressional grouping that's interested in advancing this agenda, and they're quite persistent, and they keep coming at it, and there's support among leadership to do so. So I don't rule it out at all, but I do think it takes a push, and the push is required from organizations like Oxfam to try to build a counterweight that's based on development and poverty concerns, and also from the private sector like Caterpillar, showing that there's a very broad interest in our own economy for the growth and development of other economies, especially the poorest, where the highest growth potentials are. And if we make those investments, we will benefit. It's a long story to tell, but it's an important one. And we're at a moment in history where I think it's time to sort of reframe and re-argue the points around trade. And we need a more developed trade policy. We see the Obama administration finally turning towards trade, but with what I think is a very incomplete policy towards trade. Doubling U.S. exports is, an interesting and laudable goal, but it's not a trade policy. And trade requires give and take and negotiated benefits, and putting development more explicitly into U.S. policy and into the U.S. agenda, I think would really help advance it multilaterally. And so I think this is a really great moment. This paper comes at a good time as we're beginning now to turn to trade and realize that growth in exports is going to be, we think, probably one of the core areas of growth. It was one of the only bright spots before the economic crisis, and as the recovery is coming, we expect it to be one of the growth spots. We can't expect U.S. consumer demand to grow rapidly given how shaky our employment and economy is. So we really need to have a fully developed, full spectrum agenda here, and this development piece and an explicit approach towards the least developed countries and poverty is a core part of it if we expect to see concessions and collaboration from other countries.